choices. You as a depositor paid for it. You went to go get your money, it wasn't there. And then people would hear that the bank down the street wasn't good, and they worried about their own bank, and then that would cause a run on their bank. And it became a terrible, vicious cycle. And something like 3,000 banks closed in the following couple of years after that. The whole financial system then seemed not just unstable, but worthless.
After that, when people saved money, they were very leery of banks, and money went under the mattress.
The stock market crash in 1929 did not create the Great Depression, but it did start a sequence of events that eventually culminated with the Great Depression.
Well, you know, some of this is going to sound sort of familiar. The banks were loaning money for the stock market, the companies were loaning money, the brokerages were loaning money, and when those prices fell, all that money just disappeared. Almost immediately, companies began to feel the pinch of not having the capital and of having lost money, and they began to lay off people, to let people go, to shut down production.
There were mass bankruptcies. There was a liquidity crisis of exactly the same kind we have today. That is to say, all kinds of businesses could no longer get loans to keep themselves afloat, even if those businesses were entirely solvent. They couldn't get the kind of short-term commercial credit to pay their workers, to buy new inventory, to pay their suppliers. And so they began going bankrupt. And as they went bankrupt, they laid people off. And as they laid people off, demand fell. And this is what does traumatic damage to the whole society, so traumatic that it's second only to the Civil War in American memory as a tragic moment in American history.
My father had a modest-sized insurance brokerage agency. One night at dinner, my father said that he had to fire an employee. And I very cavalierly said, well, he'll be able to get a job, won't he? And my father said, no. He's an older man who isn't very capable, and I don't think he can. And at that point, my father burst into tears. It was the first time I had ever seen my father cry.
There was such a change in our lives and all the people around me after the crash. Many of my girlfriend's fathers lost their jobs, and they couldn't pay the rent. They were evicted. The poverty was really all around us. Men had no clothing. They were in rags, really rags. They used to wrap their feet up in newspaper and put them in cardboard, makeshift shoes to walk around the street. And then if you took a walk over to Central Park, you saw this big area, a deserted reservoir that had been drained. And they made little huts of cardboard boxes, and they would sleep there overnight. And they called it Hooverville, because that was the name of our president at the time. And of course, all this stock market crash and all this poverty was, of course, put in his lap. It was really, really pitiful.
Like many others, the photographer Alice Austin struggled to keep up mortgage payments as the Great Depression took hold.
A few years into the Depression, Alice Austin runs out of money. There is nothing left. She's out of her house. They take her to a poorhouse, and it's a poorhouse out of a Dickens novel, and she lingers there for a couple of years. Miraculously, her photographs are discovered. A few of her photos are sold to Time and Life magazine, and that earns her enough money to move out of the poorhouse and into a decent retirement home. In a sense, her photographs come to her rescue and take her out of poverty and into a year or two of decent living.
Paul Warburg, who so accurately predicted the crash and the Depression, saved the bank he ran from disaster by getting out of the market in time. But it was of little consolation to him.
My great-grandfather probably never really recovered his own personal equilibrium after the crash. To be called the Cassandra of Wall Street, I think was very painful for him. And if we all remember Cassandra, she couldn't just see the future, she was also doomed to be disregarded. And I think it caused him to go into a depression of his own. I'm not sure that he ever would have said, "I told you so." I think he felt that it was really tragic, that this worldwide depression could have been averted or headed off, or at least it didn't have to crash so hard. And I think it probably led to his early death. When he died, it was the last year of Hoover's presidency, and there was no end in sight.
But in 1932, 12 years of Republican rule came to an end.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide victory. His first task was to restore confidence.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Seen as a savior, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people and to regulate the financial system.
There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
The new president acted quickly. He guaranteed bank deposits and introduced laws forcing bankers to operate under strict government supervision. An investigation into the crash was launched by the Senate Banking Committee. It would last more than 3 years, and the 10,000 pages of testimony blackened the reputation of Wall Street. The committee's ambitious lawyer, Ferdinand Pecora, challenged the banking elite to account for their behavior.
He calls these bankers to testify. And what does he learn? He learns that Charlie Mitchell of National City Corp had sold stock to his wife to avoid taxes. Richard Whitney, who had so boldly bought stock on Black Thursday, lost money of his own and began borrowing from his brother. And then when that didn't work, he began stealing from customers. He ended up in jail doing time.
The most prestigious bank in America, J.P. Morgan, was also found to be far from blameless. The hearings uncovered evidence of a list that offered preferential deals on stocks to friends in high places, including a former president.
Not only Morgan partners and Morgan family members, but also prominent corporate executives and even some politicians. Calvin Coolidge was on the preferred stock list, for example. That was a practice that a lot of people felt was wrong.
Ferdinand Pecora had a great quote. He said it was shocking disclosures of low standards in high places, which I love because, you could say the same thing today.
In response to public outrage at the bankers' dirty dealings, President Roosevelt set up the Securities and Exchange Commission. Its task, to clean up Wall Street. At its head, he chose a man who knew more about unethical practice than most.
President Roosevelt, when he introduced the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate Wall Street, named his old friend and supporter Joe Kennedy to be the first chairman. And that's putting the fox in the chicken coop.
Although Roosevelt restored confidence in the banking system, the Great Depression would last until the outbreak of World War II. Then, as now, the globalized economy meant that the crash and subsequent depression rippled out across the world. In Britain, there was a slump in manufacturing, and millions lost their jobs. Germany, still suffering from defeat in the First World War, was hit even harder.
So many people had their life savings destroyed during the Great Depression that it created in many countries a desire for some authoritarian government that would save them, that would rescue the economy.
No doubt the crash and the Depression strengthened anti-capitalist movements. The communists had taken over in Russia, and there were rising fascist movements. Mussolini was already in power in Italy, and Hitler's political base was growing in Germany. And when American-style free market capitalism suffered from this Wall Street crash followed by a depression, it just strengthened those people who wanted to say, there's a better way.
While communism and fascism prospered, many nations put up barriers to prevent free trade and turned inwards in an attempt to save their economies. Economic nationalism led to trade wars and later World War. "80 years on, those who remember the bubble of the 20s and the crash that followed feel that they have seen it all before.
I don't think we learned anything from it. I have found that people's memories are very short. They make the same type of leveraged commitments where they don't look at the downside risk.
You have a lot of cheap credit in the 1920s. Now we've had cheap credit and people have speculated in houses, and now the housing bubble has collapsed.
You have a heavily leveraged American consumer. He's in debt up to his eyeballs, and he can't sustain that debt. The subprime mortgage crisis is a symptom of that.
In the 80s and 90s, faith in the free market had revived, and as optimism returned, many of the financial regulations which Roosevelt had introduced were felt to be outdated and were slowly dismantled. Yet again, a lightly regulated market allowed speculation to grow unchecked.
We are now reaping the whirlwind of that deregulation, and in that sense we're in exactly the same position as people were in 1929 when the government turned a blind eye to what was going on in the financial world.
What I do hope and I do think is that the government has learned its lessons and is trying to take steps that are much more active and much more aggressive than what was taken in the 30s to try and stem the pain and stem the decline.
The hope is that such steps will work, but the lessons from the crash of 1929 are that history repeats itself, that human folly and greed are much stronger forces in financial affairs than reason and restraint.